Darren was a man of logic, or at least he told himself that, to survive the isolation of his third-floor apartment. The building was an old Victorian converted into flats, full of settling floorboards and plumbing that groaned like a dying animal. It was cheap, it was quiet, and usually it was safe. That changed at exactly 12 a.m. on a Tuesday. Darren was hunched over his laptop, the blue light reflecting off his glasses, when the temperature in the room plummeted. It wasn't a gradual chill. It was a sudden, violent drop that turned his breath into a ghostly mist. The silence of the night, which usually felt comforting, suddenly felt heavy, pressurized, like the air inside a diving bell. His eyes drifted toward the French doors that led to the small, decorative balcony. Being on the third floor, the balcony was a luxury, overlooking a narrow alleyway and the brick wall of the adjacent bakery. There was no fire escape, no ladders, no way up but through his living room. He saw a shadow move. At first, he thought it was a trick of his tired eyes, a floater in his vision. But then, a rhythm began. Slowly, Darren turned his head. Bathed in the sickly yellow glow of a distant street lamp, an old woman was walking on his balcony. She was hunched so low her chin nearly touched her chest. Her hair was a wild, matted halo of silver that seemed to move independently of the wind. She wore a nightgown that might have once been white, but was now the color of wet bone, tattered at the hem. She was pacing the narrow length of the balcony, 6 feet one way, 6 feet back. Her bare feet made a wet slapping sound against the cold stone. Darren's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was frozen. Logic tried to claw its way back. Is it a neighbor? Did someone climb up? But the sheer impossibility of her presence on a sheer brick wall, 30 feet in the air, silenced his reason. Then, she stopped. She was standing directly in front of the glass. She didn't turn her head. She stayed in that hunched, unnatural position. Darren held his breath, his lungs burning. He realized with a jolt of pure electricity that she wasn't looking at the room. She was looking at her own reflection in the glass. Slowly, with the sound of dry parchment tearing, she began to lift her head. Darren wanted to look away, to run into the bathroom and bolt the door, but his muscles refused to obey. As her face came into the light, he saw that she had no eyes. In their place were two jagged, hollow pits that looked like they had been gouged out with a dull spoon. Her mouth was a black, lipless hole that stretched wider than any human jaw should. She leaned closer to the glass until the tip of her gray nose touched the pane. A thin layer of frost began to spread from the point of contact. Then she spoke. It wasn't a voice, it was a vibration that rattled the glass and echoed inside Darren's skull. "Is it time?" she hissed. Darren couldn't move. He couldn't speak. The woman raised a hand, a skeletal thing with nails as long and yellow as a hawk's talons, and began to scratch at the glass. It wasn't a frantic scratching. It was rhythmic, deliberate. She began to hum a nursery rhyme that Darren dimly recognized from his childhood, but the melody was warped, shifting into minor keys that made his ears bleed. As she hummed, she began to tap her forehead against the glass. The glass began to spiderweb. Small, hairline fractures radiated out from where her head hit. "Not yet," Darren whispered, the words finally breaking free from his throat. The woman stopped. The humming ceased. The scratching died away. She turned her hollow pits toward him, and for the first time, she seemed to see him. A look of profound, agonizing hunger crossed her face. She pressed her entire body against the glass, her skin sticking to it like wet plastic. "Darren," she croaked. He hadn't told anyone in this city his name. He had moved here to be a stranger. "You left the latch unlocked," she whispered. Darren's eyes flicked to the top of the French doors. The small brass lever was turned vertically, open. The woman's hand gripped the handle on the outside. There shouldn't have been a handle on the outside. The door creaked. The cold air from the balcony began to pour in, smelling of old earth and stagnant water. Darren scrambled backward, his chair flipping over with a crash. He backed into the kitchen, grabbing a steak knife from the counter, his hands shaking so violently the blade rattled. The door swung wide. The old woman didn't walk in. She crawled. She dropped to all fours, her joints popping and snapping like dry kindling. She moved with the fluid, terrifying speed of an insect, her matted hair dragging across his hardwood floor. "It's midnight, Darren," she chirped, her voice now sounding like a young girl's. "Time for the lights to go out." She reached the edge of the living room rug, just feet away from him. She looked up, the black pits of her eyes reflecting the flickering light of his laptop. "Do you want to see what's behind the wall?" she asked. She lunged. Darren screamed, swinging the knife at the empty air as the power in the apartment suddenly cut out. In the absolute darkness, he could hear only two things: the sound of wet feet slapping against the floorboards and a soft, rhythmic humming coming from right behind his ear. When the sun rose the next morning, the apartment was silent. The French doors were closed and locked. The laptop was sitting on the desk, its battery dead. The only sign that anything had happened was a single, frosted handprint on the outside of the third-story glass, and a small yellowed fingernail embedded in the floorboards right where Darren had been standing. Darren was never seen again, but the neighbors say that sometimes, at exactly 12 a.m., they can hear the sound of two people walking on the balcony. Harold was a man of rigid habits, a creature of the daylight who found the night to be an unnecessary obstacle to productivity. His house, a modest Victorian structure on the edge of the sleeping town of Oakhaven, usually felt like a fortress. But on the night of October 12th, the fortress felt more like a cage. It began with the clock. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a heavy mahogany beast inherited from an uncle he barely remembered, began to chime. It was midnight. Harold sat up in bed, his breath hitching. The 12th chime didn't fade into the silence as it usually did. Instead, it seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, a low, resonant hum that set his teeth on edge. He climbed out of bed, the cold floor biting at his soles, and walked to the window to close the latch he'd left cracked for the autumn breeze. That was when he saw it. At first, he thought it was a trick of the moonlight hitting the old oak tree in the front yard. There was a shape, tall, impossibly thin and darker than the surrounding shadows. It stood perfectly still at the very edge of the property line, right where the street lamp's amber glow died into the darkness of his lawn. Harold squinted. The figure was at least 7 feet tall. It wore what looked like a tattered, heavy coat that dragged in the dead grass, but the proportions were wrong. The arms reached down past its knees, ending in fingers that looked like charred twigs. "Just a vagrant," Harold whispered to the empty room, his voice cracking. "Just a trespasser." He reached for the cord to pull the heavy velvet curtains shut, but his hand froze. The figure moved. It didn't walk. It tilted. Its entire torso leaned forward at a 45-degree angle, and then, with a sickening, wet crack that Harold could hear, even through the double-paned glass, it snapped its head upward. It had no face, at least not a human one. Where the eyes should have been were two jagged, weeping pits of absolute void. Its mouth was a vertical slit that stretched from where a nose should be down to the base of its throat. Harold stepped back, tripping over his slippers. He scrambled to his feet and ran to the phone on his bedside table. No dial tone. Only the sound of rhythmic, heavy breathing that seemed to be coming from the earpiece itself. A heavy weight hit the side of the house. Harold bolted to the hallway, his heart hammering against his ribs, like a trapped bird. He reached the top of the stairs and looked down. Through the narrow frosted glass panels of the front door, he saw the silhouette. The thing was no longer at the edge of the yard. It was on the porch. The vertical mouth pressed against the glass, a long gray tongue, coated in something thick and black, began to lick the pane, leaving a trail of filth that sizzled against the glass. Harold backed away into the darkness of the upper hall, retreating toward the attic door. He could hear the front door handle rattling, not the frantic jiggling of a burglar, but a slow, methodical turn. The deadbolt didn't just give way. The wood of the doorframe splintered as if hit by a battering ram. He burst into the attic, slamming the door and shoving a heavy trunk against it. He huddled in the corner behind a stack of old newspapers, staring at the sliver of light beneath the door. The house fell silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs had stopped. Then, the floorboards in the hallway began to groan, one by one. The sound moved past his bedroom, past the bathroom. It stopped right outside the attic door. Harold held his breath until his lungs burned. From the other side of the wood, a voice spoke. It wasn't a voice made of vocal cords. It sounded like dry leaves skittering over a gravestone. "Harold," it rasped, "you forgot to wind the clock." A long, charred finger pushed through the wood of the door as if it were wet paper. Then another. The trunk he had used as a barricade began to slide backward, pushed by a strength that defied the laws of physics. As the door swung open, the smell of ozone and rotting meat filled the cramped room. The entity filled the doorway, its head scraping the low ceiling. It leaned forward, that vertical mouth opening wide to reveal rows of needle-like teeth, each one inscribed with symbols that seemed to bleed light. The last thing Harold saw before the world went black was the grandfather clock downstairs starting to chime again. It was still midnight, and it would be midnight forever. The grandfather clock in the hallway of Donnell's Victorian fixer-upper didn't just chime, it groaned. It was a heavy metallic sound that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards, marking the transition into the dead of night. 12 a.m. Donnell sat at her kitchen island, the blue light of her laptop screen casting sharp, unnatural shadows against the peeling floral wallpaper. She had moved into the house 3 months ago, drawn to its character, a realtor's euphemism for a place where the history felt thick enough to breathe. Tonight, the air felt particularly heavy, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm that never breaks. She was about to close her laptop when she heard it. It wasn't a floorboard creak or the settling of the foundation. It was a thin, wet sound, a hiccup. Then a long, trembling intake of breath that dissolved into a soft, melodic sob. Donnell froze. She lived alone. The nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down a gravel road choked with pine trees. "Hello," she called out. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the darkness of the dining room. The crying didn't stop. It was coming from the parlor, the room she hadn't yet renovated, the one that always stayed 5 degrees colder than the rest of the house. She grabbed her phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing like tiny insects. As she stepped into the hallway, the crying became clearer. It was rhythmic, the inconsolable weeping of a child. She rounded the corner into the parlor. The beam of her light hit the far corner near the boarded-up fireplace. There, sitting on the bare floorboards, was a small figure, a girl, perhaps 6 years old, wearing a nightgown that was a shade of white so dull it looked gray. Her hair was lank and dark, obscuring her face as she tucked her head into her knees. Her shoulders shook with every sob. "Oh my God," Donnell whispered, her fear momentarily eclipsed by a surge of maternal instinct. "Hey, honey, are you okay? How did you get in here?" Donnell took a step forward. The floorboard under her foot shrieked. The crying stopped instantly. The silence that followed was worse than the sobbing. It was an active silence, an expectant one. "I'm not going to hurt you," Donnell said, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Where are your parents?" The child didn't look up. "I can't find the way out," the girl whispered. Her voice didn't sound like a child's. It was too resonant, like two voices speaking in unison, one high and one a low, gravelly rasp. "It's too dark in the walls?" Donnell's skin crawled. "The walls? Honey, let's get you to the kitchen. It's bright there. We'll call for help." Donnell reached out a hand, stopping just inches from the girl's shoulder. Up close, she noticed something horrifying. The girl's nightgown wasn't just dirty, it was charred at the hem, and the smell of old soot and something sickly sweet, like rotting lilies, began to fill the room. "Look at me," Donnell urged softly. The child began to turn her head. It didn't move smoothly. It moved in sharp, mechanical twitches, like a broken film reel. When the face finally met the light of Danelle's phone, Danelle's scream died in her throat. The girl had no eyes. Where they should have been were two smooth, seamless patches of pale skin. Her mouth, however, was wide, too wide for a human face, and filled with rows of needle-thin, translucent teeth. The creature didn't smile. It opened its mouth, and the crying sound started again, but this time, the girl's lips didn't move. The sound was coming from deep within her throat, a recording played back through a wet filter. "You're not a child," Danelle gasped, stumbling backward. The thing stood up, its limbs elongated as it rose, its joints popping with the sound of snapping dry wood. It stood nearly 7 feet tall now, the small nightgown stretched tight over a skeletal, distorted frame. "I'm hungry," the two-tone voice rasped. "The dark is so hungry." Danelle turned to bolt, but the parlor door didn't lead to the hallway anymore. It opened into a space of absolute velvet blackness. She spun around, her flashlight beam swinging wildly. The creature was gone from the corner. She felt a cold, damp breath on the nape of her neck. 12:01, the voice whispered directly into her ear. "The hour of the uninvited." Danelle swung her phone around, but the light hit nothing but the peeling wallpaper. Then she looked down. Small, soot-stained handprints were appearing on her own white shirt, starting from her waist and moving upward, as if something invisible was climbing her. The crying started again, muffled and close. It was coming from inside her own chest. Danelle fell to her knees, clawing at her throat as she felt a cold, small hand reach out from behind her ribs, grasping for the light. The grandfather clock groaned once more. It was only the beginning of the longest night of her life.